Good evening, everyone. I am Pallab, and tonight we gather not simply to listen to a lecture, but to engage with a thinker whose work has fundamentally transformed how we understand politics, democracy, and the delicate architecture of rights in modern India. If democracy is often measured by the health of its institutions, its freedoms, and its capacity for dissent, then Professor Joya Hassan teaches us that it must also be measured by whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. Professor Joya Hassan's scholarship compels us to look beyond electoral numbers and constitutional promises and instead to examine the everyday workings of power that shape the lives of citizens across her pioneering works, dominance and mobilization, politics and the state in India. And her incisive studies on minorities' representation and democratic governance, she reminds us that democracy is never a completed project. Rather, it is a fragile negotiation between the state and society, between majorities and minorities, between power and precariousness. Her intellectual contribution stands at the intersection of political science, sociology, and contemporary history. Professor Hassan interrogates the structures that undergird political life, the nature of state authority, the shifts within party politics, the dynamics of social justice movements, and the difficult terrain of minority rights. With clarity and courage, she illuminates how power is accumulated, how it is contested, and how it is justified. And in doing so, she shows us that the health of a democracy depends not only on laws and institutions, but on the moral imagination of its citizens. What makes Professor Hassan truly exceptional is her commitment to revealing the texture of democratic life, how policies shape everyday freedoms, how representation translates or fails to translate into dignity, and how the promises of equality are constantly renegotiated in the face of social hierarchies. Her work invites us to see democracy not as a distant ideal but as a light, material experience deeply shaped by gender, religion, caste, and class. Tonight, as he speaks on the crucial theme, how is the world's largest democracy holding up? Professor Hassan invites us into a conversation that is both urgent and unsettling. She asks us to grapple with unforgettable questions. What happens when institutions weaken? What forms does dissent take when political space narrows? How do minorities navigate shifting landscapes of power? And what does it mean to safeguard democratic values in times of profound social and political upheaval? On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, it is an immense honor to welcome Professor Joya Hassan, a scholar of remarkable integrity and intellectual fearlessness, whose work challenges us to interrogate our assumptions and rethink the boundaries of democratic possibility. Her presence here today is not merely an academic privilege, it is an invitation to reflect more deeply, question more honestly, and imagine more courageously the democratic futures we must collectively build. We welcome her with deep respect and gratitude for reminding us that democracy survives not through complacency but through vigilance, critique, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Professor, up to you.
Thank you very much, Pallab, for that very nice and generous introduction. And thank you to the Voices from the Periphery for inviting me to give this lecture. And it's a pleasure to speak to your forum. Now, the title of my talk is How is the World's Largest Democracy Holding Up? How well is the world's largest democracy holding up? In short, with difficulty. India's democratic framework remains formally intact. Procedurally, India's democracy continues to function. Elections are held with clockwork regularity, voter turnout remains high, often exceeding that of many Western democracies, and elections across states remain highly competitive. Yet, beneath this participatory vigor, the integrity of key institutions has steadily eroded. The erosion is driven by a deliberate political project of the Hindu right aiming to reshape liberal democracy into a majoritarian order, a dynamic that has been documented extensively by recent empirical data and political analysis, as explored in this lecture this evening. Now, the historical context. India's emergence as a democratic republic in 1947 marked a defining moment in world history. Solidified by the 1950 Constitution, Indian democracy built robust institutions, a vibrant press, a multi party system, and protections for minority rights. This audacious experiment was exceptional in the post colonial world, where newly independent states often veered towards authoritarianism or single party rule. India, by contrast, maintained democratic governance over decades, institutionalizing electoral competition, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. It was interrupted only briefly during the emergency of 1975 to 1977. A foundational strength of Indian democracy has been its refusal to define national unity in terms of any single identity, religious, linguistic, or ethnic. The constitutional order explicitly accommodated diversity, protecting minority rights, and promoting federalism in a society where difference was the norm. Yet in recent decades, these pluralist foundations have come under strain. The balance envisioned by the founders has changed. This shift sets the stage for the emergence of a political system increasingly defined by majoritarian dominance. This brings me to the second part, which is the post 2014 turn, which is really the period that I'm focusing on in this lecture. India's pluralist democratic equilibrium began to shift with the rise of Hindu nationalism and the Bharatiya Janata Party in 2014. That year, the BJP displaced the Congress party at the center, securing a decisive Lok Sabha majority with 282 of the 543 seats and bringing Sri Narendra Modi to power as the Prime Minister. The party consolidated its dominance in 2019, expanding its majority to 303 seats. Its leadership interpreted this mandate as a license to advance an ambitious ideological agenda, one that has driven a fundamental reconfiguration of state institutions along majoritarian lines. Ideas once considered far right, previously confined to the margins, have now moved into the mainstream, shaping government policy and public discourse and signaling a significant shift in the country's broader ideological orientation. The government wasted no time in translating its vision of a majoritarian India into policy. Among the most consequential moves was the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A in August 2019, which stripped the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir of its special constitutional status, and what is more, downgraded the state into two union territories. This was followed by the Supreme Court's Ayodhya verdict that effectively legitimized the Babri Masjid demolition and aligned the judiciary with dominant political narratives. The shift was deepened by the Citizenship Amendment Act and the proposed National Register for Citizens, which introduced religion as a criterion for citizenship. These three measures laid bare an ideological shift towards a Hindu centric national vision, departing sharply from the Republic's secular, inclusive foundations. Now, the new political order that came into existence through these policies and processes rests on three interlinked pillars: majoritarianism, which privileges the ethnic majority, an increasingly centralized exercise of power, and a close alliance between the ruling party and big capital and international capital. Together, they produce a landscape where inequality, centralization, and illiberalism reinforce one another to entrench dominance. This has brought about a democratic backsliding, which is the next section of my talk. Unlike the emergency of 1975-1977, when democratic procedures were formally suspended, the sweeping transformation since 2014 has been carried out through legal and administrative channels rather than the formal suspension of democracy. Power has become increasingly concentrated in the executive, with the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, wielding disproportionate influence and diminishing the role of Parliament and state governments. This reflects a broader shift towards personalized governance, where key decisions such as the 2016 demonetization, the 2019 cross-border surgical strikes, and the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown were taken unilaterally, often bypassing institutional procedures and federal coordination mechanisms. Simultaneously, key oversight bodies, including the Reserve Bank of India, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Central Vigilance Commission, the National Investigative Agency, the Central Information Commission, which has been hugely diluted, and above all, the Election Commission of India, have faced significant erosion of autonomy, weakening the country's system of checks and balances. Concurrently, the space for political opposition has narrowed. This trend is evident in the BJP's pursuit of a Congress Mukt Bharat or a Congress Free India, which extends beyond electoral rivalry to a broader effort to marginalize political rivals. The objective appears to be the construction of a hegemonic party system in which dissent is institutionally and discursively weakened, both in formal forums such as Parliament and in the public sphere. This reflects a pattern observed in many countries where opposition parties are allowed a formal existence but are functionally excluded from meaningful participation in democracy. Although this regime wields unprecedented power, it is markedly more intolerant of criticism, driven by a sense that its project of thought control remains incomplete. It seeks to monitor and discipline anyone who thinks independently, branding dissent as anti national, and coercing social groups that protest as that, that and coercing social groups that protest or resist. This systematic delegitimization of dissent, coupled with the targeting of human rights defenders and the erosion of institutional autonomy, forms the foundation of the new political order. Civil society space has sharply contracted as the state curtails NGOs' activity through increasingly restrictive FCRA amendments, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which have choked foreign funding and led to the cancellation of thousands of NGO registrations since 2020, and over 20,000 registrations were cancelled in 2021 alone. Critics, as I just said a moment ago, are routinely labeled as anti national, a tactic that equates dissent with disloyalty and again echoes similar rhetoric in countries like the United States, Turkey, Hungary, Philippines, and so on. So, suppression of protests and other forms of dissent has become a defining feature of this playbook. Academic institutions, which were once centers of critical inquiry, now face mounting pressure. The UGC, the University Grants Commission, has imposed tighter controls on foreign collaborations, dictated syllabus content, and promoted what they call patriotic education, while campuses have seen repeated effort to curb protests. Faculty critical of government face harassment or legal action. These interventions aim to narrow the scope of permissible discourse and align academic work with a majoritarian agenda, echoing developments such as Hungary's expulsion of the Central European University from Budapest a few years ago, and a series of dismissals and suspensions in Turkey, targeting university staff and teachers who were accused of links to a 2016 coup attempt, particularly known as the Gulen movement. The media landscape has undergone a similar transformation. Government control over advertising revenue, the use of regulatory agencies to penalize critical outlets, and the consolidation of ownership among business groups aligned with the ruling party have produced a homogenized media environment where state-aligned media outlets dominate and critical voices are and critical voices are pushed to the margins. Investigative journalists face legal harassment and intimidation, while tightened social media rules and content takedowns further restrict digital spaces for dissent, ensuring that government-friendly narratives prevail in the public sphere and thus reducing the visibility of critical perspectives and those who are in opposition to the government. All this has been accompanied by the growth of unprecedented economic inequalities. So these political transformations that I have outlined have unfolded alongside and often reinforced a dramatic rise in economic inequality. India now faces a sharp escalation in economic disparities across regions, across classes, across communities, across caste groups. According to the Paris based World Inequality Lab, headed by the economist Thomas Piketty, the share of the top 1% of the population in national income, which was around 12% at the time of independence, after falling to about 6% in 1982, has surged to roughly 23% in 2023. It's the highest level in a century. So the concentration of wealth, unprecedented even in colonial times, marks one of the most severe gaps between the rich and the poor in India's modern history. This extreme inequality is deeply linked to an intensified state corporate sector nexus, defined by the increasing proximity of business elites to political power. India's largest corporations now lead not only in revenue and assets, but also in their ability to shape policy and political outcomes. Their reach spans critical sectors, including airports, power generation, and infrastructure, to just name a very few, and extends into political finance through instruments such as electoral bonds and the PM CARES Fund, none of which are transparent in their working. This concentration of corporate power has depended on sustained policy support, reinforcing a pattern in which business interests leverage political ties to secure regulatory advantages and lucrative, often opaque opportunities. Corporate magnates such as Mukesh Ambani have historically benefited from political connections, and that is a well known story. While in recent years, the nexus has further deepened, most visibly in Gautam Adani, most evident and visible in Gautam Adani's rapid expansion, aided by regulatory shifts and major privatization deals frequently concluded outside transparent tendering processes. It is said that just about five corporate magnates dominate the economy. Now, India's affluent then wield outsized influence over political parties, campaign finance, and the media, above all, reflecting a deepening convergence between corporate capital, the Hindu right, and the state. It is this triumvirate which dominates politics, economy, and society. This mutually reinforcing alliance consolidates corporate power while entrenching majoritarian politics, an arrangement fundamentally at odds with democracy, leave alone democratic equality. As millions face joblessness, precarious work, and inadequate basic public services, political attention has shifted instead to identity, national security, and symbolic conflicts, redirecting public frustration towards imaginary threats from minorities while leaving underlying economic conditions and economic precarity untouched. But it's not, the story is not, the contemporary story is not just about the growth of economic inequality. What is striking today is the disquieting political inequality. Economic inequalities have been reinforced by growing political inequality. Political inequality in India now rests on three levers of control: the election Commission of India, the ECI, electoral rules, and campaign finance, all of which have tilted in favor of the ruling party. A pliant election commission has given the government undue influence over an institution once lauded worldwide for its neutrality, even as it now faces mounting accusations of partisanship in enforcing the electoral rules, in enforcing the model code of conduct, in regulation of campaign finance, and above all, in the revision of electoral rules, which is now underway in 12 states, including in West Bengal. Now, what this has produced is an erosion of trust in the Election Commission, which is a new development and which many surveys have actually found to be the case. So erosion of trust in the Election Commission underscores the importance of institutional independence, transparency, and accountability. Now, the introduction of electoral bonds in 2014 further entrenched the unequal playing field and unequal political competition. Presented as a move towards cleaner, more transparent funding, the scheme instead enabled unlimited anonymous corporate donations, mainly to the Bharatiya Janata Party. Analysis by the Association of Democratic Reforms, the ADR, and independent researchers further demonstrate that the ruling party secured the vast majority of bond-linked donations. The financial advantage this has given enabled the party to go in for unparalleled advertising campaigns, expansive digital operations, and an organizational reach far exceeding that of its rivals. The asymmetry is compounded by the use of state resources for government advertising, policy announcements timed before elections, and disbursements during elections, and welfare schemes that are targeted at key constituencies. Now, concerns about political inequality that I'm now talking about have deepened with recent changes that threaten the inclusiveness of the electoral process itself. The Election Commission's new Special Investigative Revision, SIR, initiative, piloted in Bihar in June, and now, as I just said, extended to 12 states and underway right now in all of these states, marks a troubling shift in voter registration. By transferring responsibility for enrollment from the state to individual citizens, or from the Election Commission to individual citizens, the SIR alters the foundations of universal adult franchise. Global evidence shows that self-initiated systems such as the one that the SIR has established now, lead to sharp drops in registration, especially among marginalized groups. Now, maintaining comprehensive and clean and accurate electoral rolls is not merely an administrative matter, which is the responsibility of the Election Commission. It is a constitutional obligation and a measure of democratic inclusiveness. Democracy depends not just on the act of voting, but in the citizens' confidence that every vote is counted as it is cast and that electoral institutions remain impartial and transparent in their functioning. If trust in the integrity of the vote erodes, so does the legitimacy of the government that is elected through this process. Now, all of this then has unsurprisingly led to democratic erosion. And the domestic concerns about democratic decline are mirrored in global assessments that document India's backsliding since 2014. Taken together, these findings of various international assessments indicate that while elections continue, the liberal and institutional foundations of our democracy have weakened markedly in the post 2014 period. To understand why the world's largest democracy is under stress, we must situate it within a wider resurgence of the right and a global democratic recession that has been a consequence of this. Across continents, liberal democratic systems are showing signs of structural decline. Rather than relying on dramatic coups, today's backsliding unfolds incrementally through legal and institutional means, weakening checks and balances, centralizing authority, curtailing civil liberties, while retaining the shell of democracy and democratic rhetoric. Between 2016 and 2021, right-wing parties rose to power across Europe, North America, Latin America, and parts of Asia. By 2024, the global political center of gravity had shifted markedly to the right. Major democracies such as India and the United States are now led by figures associated with far-right politics. Political trends in Hungary, Austria, Italy, Netherlands, Israel, Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, and many other countries indicate a broader transnational realignment in which right-wing ideologies have gained electoral success, political legitimacy, and sustained influence in government. The global pattern reflects a fusion of neoliberal economic policies with majoritarian ideologies. This is largely responsible for the rise of the right and the consequential decline and erosion of democracy across the world. The convergence of big capital with nationalist and socially conservative forces has deepened inequality and insecurity, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, and it has exposed the limits of neoliberalism, indeed the limits of liberalism, rendering its systemic logic, that is, the systemic logic of neoliberalism, increasingly untenable. A key consequence has been the sharp rise in inequality within countries, an upward trend especially pronounced in the world's biggest economies, most notably in India and the United States. This shift has real and troubling consequences, mainly a growth in the politics of hate, exclusion, and dehumanization, which increasingly shape policy and public sentiment. The widespread indifference shown towards the human catastrophes, such as the genocide and mass starvation in Gaza, illustrates how such brutal violence has been normalized under the global ascendancy of the right. India exemplifies this global trend. But unlike many Western cases, what is at stake in the Indian context is a deeply rooted tradition of pluralism and exceptional social heterogeneity and diversity. These foundational features are increasingly strained by the rise of religious nationalism and religiosity supported by the state, which symbolizes a potent dynamic that undermines the very norms and institutional principles that have historically sustained India's pluralist model of democratic governance. India's institutional retreat is therefore far more concerning, for it signals not merely democratic backsliding, but the unraveling of a political equilibrium that enabled coexistence within profound diversity. This is not an unintended drift or a slow decay, but part of a deliberate and sustained political project, one that seeks to systematically recast Indian democracy on majoritarian lines, rewriting the philosophical and ideological foundations of the republic itself, while recalibrating the relationship between state power, citizenship, collective identity, and crucially, using electoral victories to legitimize the continued expansion of executive authority. The strategy is clear: consolidate power by restructuring the rules of political competition, curtailing dissent, and strategically leveraging social and economic divides to cultivate political dependency and secure durable loyalty. Its operational logic is equally clear, is equally explicit, actively engineering and reinforcing economic concentration, promoting one party dominance, and transforming existing societal cleavages into political instruments that reward allegiance while penalizing dissent. In conclusion, then, India's recent political experience underscores a central lesson for the world. Elections alone cannot safeguard a pluralist democracy without robust institutional checks. When majoritarian politics is intertwined with corporate power, it can erode pluralism from within. The political consequence is not merely rising inequality, but who succeeds in mobilizing the discontent. Economic frustration can be captured, and indeed has been captured, more readily by majoritarian appeals, as we have seen in the most recent elections in Bihar, than by inclusive redistributive movements When institutions lack public confidence and opposition forces struggle to sustain organizational cohesion and political unity. Progressive economic agendas can compete with majoritarian narratives, but only when institutions and organizations command public trust and movements succeed in evolving into durable political formations. Such institutional confidence and movement party alignments remain far more elusive in India's democratic ecosystem. Over the long arc of its democratic journey, India has endured cycles of regression and renewal. From the resistance to the emergency to recent mass mobilizations against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the sustained farmers' agitations in 2021, India has repeatedly demonstrated a capacity for democratic self correction, driven by courts, by movements, and by civic political action. These counterweights remain active, yet they operate today in a far more structurally constrained environment where financial and economic asymmetries in politics, constraints on dissent, and executive dominance test the durability of constitutional safeguards. Reversing these trends will require action both within and beyond the state to reclaim the Republic's founding vision, a task made urgent and more complex under right wing dispensation. So then, how is the world's largest democracy faring? The verdict is mixed and uneven. India's electoral arena continues to show remarkable resilience, reflected in mass participation and the regular transfer of power through voting. While the act of voting still draws extraordinary public enthusiasm, the institutions designed to secure equal rights, accountability, transparency, and economic equality and political parity face unprecedented pressures. The future of India's democracy will depend on restoring and fortifying the guardrails that surround it, not just the right to vote itself, but the reinforcements that keep electoral power institution bound and rule governed rather than distorted by structural imbalances. Thank you very much.
Uh, Thank you so much, Professor Hassan, for that deeply insightful and compelling lecture. Your reflections on the current state of the world's largest democracy have not only sharpened our understanding of the political landscape, but have also reminded us of the responsibilities, vulnerabilities, and ethical stakes embedded in democratic life. The way you connected institutional shifts with the lived realities of citizens, especially those at the margins, was truly enlightening. You have offered us a framework that moves beyond surface level political analysis, arguing us instead to confront the subtle, everyday negotiations through which democracy is strengthened, weakened, or transformed. We are profoundly grateful for the clarity, courage, and intellectual depth you shared with us this evening. Your lecture has opened avenues of thought that compel us to reflect more critically on power, representation, and the future of democratic rights. Now, we would like to open the floor for questions and reflections. I invite everyone to engage with Professor Hassan's arguments, to push, probe, converse, and continue the vital dialogue that her lecture has so powerfully set into rotation. Ma'am, can I ask the questions from our YouTube platform, ma'am?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The first question is from Arnav Rakit. He is asking, in recent years, many democracies have seen governments with strong electoral mandates coincide with the weakening of institutional checks and balances. How would we evaluate the health of a democracy when electoral legitimacy increases at the same time that institutional autonomy of the judiciary, media, and bureaucracy appears to erode?
Yeah, very good question. But in a way, the lecture was aimed at addressing this. You're quite right that there is a disbalance between electoral democracy, which is functioning, as you say, reasonably well, but the institutions that undergird it uh, and on the basis of which it runs are not autonomous. But I think what is uh, important to note is that even electoral democracy, as I have argued in this lecture, is not functioning as well as it did in the past. For a long time, it has been argued by scholars of democracy that India lacked substantive democracy. I mean, we made some attempts towards establishing a social democracy, but we were not as successful as, for example, many European countries or even many Asian countries.
Ma'am? Hello, ma'am. I think your connection is
Yeah, now I think it's back now, isn't it?
yeah, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, we have not been as successful in establishing a social democracy, but it was widely acknowledged that that India's electoral democracy was working well. But now I think there's a slippage even in electoral democracy. And if we look at the way in which this whole, well, I mean, now there are, of course, so many complaints about elections, about election results, or, for example, I mean, the even the model code of conduct is not being applied properly. For example, in Bihar, in Bihar, this whole Mahila Yojana, which gave 10,000 to women to start some kind of an for entrepreneurship. Now, that was announced just 10 days before the elections, which is, I suppose, permissible, although even there should be some thinking on whether a government can announce a program so close to the election. But in this case, I think in case of Bihar, the problem was also that that distribution and disbursements went on after the model code of conduct was enforced. Opposition parties complained to the election commission that distribution of 10,000 should not happen during the campaign period, but the election commission said, no, this is an ongoing scheme which was announced before the model code of conduct, so it's okay. Whereas the election commission had stopped the Karnataka government, the Rajasthan government from carrying on with disbursements for similar schemes during the campaign period. So I think even electoral democracy, there are problems now.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, Shubhashish raised.
Yeah, ma'am, my question is, I'm Subhashish Banerjee, I'm from Vishwa Bharati. So my question is, why always see from a particular lens or particular chashma while talking about our constitution, our democracy, our vote, etc. So why from a particular lens? So this is my question.
Sorry, I didn't get your point. You're saying
Yeah,
why?
why from a particular lens or particular chashma to while talking about democracy, our
So
constitution?
what? So what are you saying? I mean, why are we looking at
I
it from
say
a particular?
basically why from a one-sided view or from a particular point of view or particular ideologies while we talking about our democracy, our constitution,
So
our
what should be
votes.
the view?
Yeah, this is my question. Why from a particular point of view? This is
No,
left,
but
this is
I'm
right.
asking you, what is wrong with? I mean, is it possible? I don't know what you mean by a particular view, and I don't know what can be a multi-view, which is what you're asking about. Obviously, when you're giving an assessment, you're going to give your own assessment, and if that assessment is empirically demonstrated and is factual, then that is the issue. The issue is not ideology or view. I mean, surely in politics, I mean, politics is not physics, isn't it? Even I'm not sure even whether science is so neutral, but surely politics is not something which is like physics or mathematics. How can you simply remove uh, positions, points of view, and ideology from an assessment of democracy? You tell me what can be a non-ideological perspective. I'm not aware of it. Maybe you can tell us something about it.
No, from not from a particular ideology. Basically, in academics, we see that from a particular point of view imposed towards student. At least my observation from my college days that Hindi, Hindustan. So why always a particular point of view? I don't. I
No,
why?
I'm still not able to understand what is it that you're worrying about. You're worrying about
Basically,
what
I means
happens in your university, or are you commenting on the lecture?
no, I'm not lecturer at university because I try to say that why always from a view means the why always from a
I
leftist
think
view.
that is, let me just say that that's unavoidable. As but what should be avoided a is a position which is not backed by information, which is not backed by facts, and which is not empirically founded.
Thank you so much, Professor. Okay, so the next question from YouTube, that's from Ayush Dev. He is asking, a defining feature of democracy is the protection of dissent, critique, and oppositional politics.
Yeah,
Hello?
yeah, yeah.
When the space for dissent becomes increasingly narrow, whether through legal restrictions, political polarization, or social intimidation, does the form of democracy remain intact even as its substantive foundation weakens? In other words, at what point does the suppression of dissent transform a democracy into merely the performance of one?
Well, I mean, we can see, well, if dissent is suppressed, uh, I mean, for example, let's take the case of Russia at the moment. In in Russia, dissent is suppressed, which has led to so many dissidents fleeing Russia, mm, and or not being allowed to compete in elections. And we have a situation where the same party, the same leader is elected uh, again and again, leading to the establishment of a single party rule. And that then can in many countries, and that has happened in many countries historically, and even as we speak, can lead to fascism or proto fascism. So, suppression of dissent is dangerous because dissent is at the very heart of democracy, and if it is suppressed, it endangers democracy, and it transforms democracy into a majoritarian democracy, which can then eventually develop into uh, into a very authoritarian form of democracy. So, for example, very many scholars say that India, as indeed many other countries today, have a kind of authoritarian populism, or a kind of a competitive authoritarianism, which means political. In India, you don't, unlike Russia and many other countries which have only single parties or one party rule, we do not have one party rule. We are different from those countries in that we have what is called competitive authoritarianism, which means party competition is allowed, but it is but it is circumscribed.
Thank you so much, Professor. The next question is from Sagnik. He is asking, democracies often claim universality, yet their
Democracy.
practice,
Sorry, say that
yeah, ma'am?
again. Yeah,
Democracies often claim universality.
universality.
Yeah. Yet their practices frequently reflect majoritarian anxieties and exclusions. How does a democracy reconcile itself with growing forms of culture, religious, or political exclusion, especially toward minorities, without undermining the ethical code on which democratic citizenship rests?
Absolutely, very good point. Actually, all the points are very, very relevant. I think that is the pitfall of an ethnic democracy, or the pitfall of a majoritarian democracy, where democracy doesn't disappear, but democracy takes a different form and shape, which is majoritarian, which privileges the majority community, the religion of the majority community, the interests of the majority community, and excludes minorities. And we know from our past experience in India, as indeed from the best practices of democracies across the world, that minority rights are a very important feature of democracy. If you disprivilege minorities, and if you reduce minorities to a second class status, either through exclusion or by not including them in the public sphere, by not giving tickets to them in elections, by their underrepresentation in parliament, by their underrepresentation in governance, that weakens democracy hugely. And and as you were pointing out, that is something that goes against, if you will, the very basic idea of democracy, which is equal rights, which is equal citizenship. Everyone is equal before law. Everyone should have equal access to opportunities. So yes, ethnic democracies, which are increasingly evident, uh, certainly lack ethical foundations.
Thank you so much, Professor. Next question is from Piali. She's asking, if democracy is traditionally theorized as a balance between state power and citizen agency, how do we reinterpret democratic theory when the state increasingly governs through surveillance, securitization, and moral regulation rather than consent?
Rather than, sorry,
Consent, ma'am.
well, that again is a very, very important point. And again, I think uh, that has been the case in many countries. Digital technology is important, and surely we all stand to gain from digital technology, such as what we are able to do right now in online lecture. But digital technology has its downsides. It has produced a very elaborate technologies of surveillance, and I think very and right and right wing regimes seem to be particularly adept in using digital technology for surveillance, for regulation, and so on. And so. You're quite right that democracy is based on popular consent, not on manufactured consent. And that is what we are witnessing. And if we look at all the new rules that are being introduced by the present government in India with regard with regard to regulation of digital media, social media, and so on, in a way, are all attempts at regulating and controlling dissent and creating consent through regulation.
Thank you so much, Professor. Next question is from Arindam. He is asking, in political theory, majoritarianism is often justified through the will of the people. Yet the people is itself a constructed category. How do we critically unpack who gets counted as part of this imagined collective, and what does this reveal about the limits of democratic universality?
Well, that is a question that is, I must confess, hard to answer. I'm not even sure if I've understood the question fully. Are you pointing towards the limits of popular will and the construction of popular will, which, as you say, is constructed through various means? So I'm not clear what is it that you are saying, and are you also pointing towards the limits of democracy itself? Well, there are obvious limits. I'm not sure if there are limits of democracy, and if there are limits, there are probably so far there are no better alternatives. I think there is a case for improving democracy, for reforming democracy, for strengthening democracy, and especially strengthening institutions of democracy. There is a case for increasing equality in a world which is so increasingly unequal. So all of that is certain, and obviously democracy hasn't been hasn't been very good in achieving all of this. But so democracy is far from perfect. But perhaps an imperfect democracy is better than any authoritarian system.
And the last question is from Shanton. He is asking, classical democratic theory assumes a public sphere grounded in rational deliberation. But contemporary politics is shaped by affect, identity, and digitally mediated emotions. How must democratic theory adapt when political legitimacy is produced, not through deliberation, but through spectacle, polarization, and performative nationalism?
I think that again is an extremely important issue. I think you're basically making the point about the growing significance of identity politics, which, and especially in our country, where identity politics decides election outcomes. If we look at, identity politics outweighs and trumps redistribution or redistributive politics. So there are obvious issues with regard to identity politics, which is important in many respects because identity is also the basis of recognition. It is also the basis of dignity. It can also be the basis of rights, of affirmative action. So we cannot dismiss identity, but at the same time, the kind of identity politics that has become dominant in our country, as indeed in many other countries, is clearly problematic because it is an identity politics that is not really combining identity with distribution. For example, if we look at the recent election of the mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani. Now, Zohran Mamdani's election in the richest city, in the richest country of the world, gives us many lessons, which, even though obviously elections in India are not comparable to elections in New York, but there are some lessons for in the kind of campaign that Zohran Mamdani ran in the New York mayoral election, where he was very, where he presented himself unapologetically as a Muslim, but at the same time, his entire campaign was not one where people were being mobilized on the basis of identity. They were being mobilized around a platform of affordability, of public transit, of cost of living, public education, public transport. So the campaign itself was around these policies, and these are policies which he was obviously pointing out would benefit everyone across identity. So it was a very interesting campaign where identity was important, but the campaign itself and the public mobilization transcended identities on a platform of affordability. And he was able to do that because of the kind of network of organizations that came together, and because of the trust that people in New York, or let's say in many cities of America, have in institutions. In India, what we are lacking is that transcendence of identity into sort of a broader platform that would address the concerns and needs of everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the truly compelling and thought provoking lecture. Your insights into the current condition of the world's largest democracy. I think anyone put a comment.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Ma'am, Sudipto Mondal, I think. Sudipto, you can unmute yourself, sir. Hello?
I think it's okay. You can please go ahead.
Okay. So, your insights into the current condition of the world's largest democracy have not only sharpened our understanding of political transformation in India, but have also challenged us to rethink what democratic resilience, rights, and accountability mean in our present moment. The way you wove together empirical analysis with a nuanced reading of institutions, citizenship, and minority rights was profoundly illuminating. You have opened up important ways of thinking about how power circulates, how it is consolidated, contested, and experienced by different communities. In doing so, you have reminded us that democracy is not merely a structure of governance but a living, evolving ethic that must be constantly protected, questioned, and revitalized. We are deeply grateful for the intellectual clarity and courage you have shared with us this evening. Your lecture has enriched our understanding and has offered us a critical lens through which to view the promises and perils of democratic life today. Now, we would like to pen and conclude this lecture. And thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today.
Thank you very much to Voices from the Periphery, and thank you to Pallab and to Rakhi, and thank you very much for this very, very interesting session on the world's largest democracy. Thank you. It was a pleasure
Thank you.
to
Thank you.
participate in this discussion.